Morality comes from God, they say. But let's pause right there. If morality truly came from God, why does it look so much like obedience instead of goodness? Why do the so-called moral heroes of religion act less like people of conscience and more like soldiers following orders, no matter how cruel those orders might be? The uncomfortable truth is that religion didn't invent morality. It hijacked it. What was once about courage, empathy, and reason was repackaged into obedience, submission, and fear of punishment. Think about it. When a believer says something is wrong, how often do they explain why it's wrong? Usually the answer is, because God said so. That's not morality, that's compliance. A truly moral act comes from understanding, not from fear. If you avoid murder because you understand that killing harms others and destroys trust, that's morality. If you avoid murder because you're afraid God might burn you in hell, that's not morality. That's cowardice disguised as virtue. And yet religion has always rewarded that cowardice. The saints in religious stories aren't people who thought for themselves. They're people who obeyed without question. Abraham was ready to stab his own son because God demanded it. And that act is celebrated as faith. But what kind of father would lift a knife over his child just because a voice told him to? A moral man would have said no. A moral man would have protected his child. But Abraham's obedience, not his conscience, was praised as righteousness. That's not morality, that's submission. And submission is the foundation of every major religion. They call it faith. They glorify surrender, as if refusing to think for yourself is a noble act. They teach people to bow before authority, not to question it. They tell you that doubt is evil, that asking why is dangerous. But think about this. If morality really came from divine wisdom, why would it depend on blind faith? Why would it need fear to keep people in line? Why would it punish curiosity, the very thing that leads humans toward understanding and truth? Religion's moral system was built to control, not to enlighten. It tells you what to do, but not why. It trains obedience, not conscience. That's why people who think they are moral often become dangerous when they stop thinking for themselves. History gives us countless examples. The Crusaders slaughtered thousands in the name of Christ, believing they were defending the holy faith. The Inquisition tortured and burned people alive, convinced they were saving souls. Even today, religious extremists bomb, shoot, and oppress, all with a clean conscience, because their moral compass points not to empathy or reason, but to obedience. The frightening part is that when people believe their morality comes from divine authority, they can justify any cruelty. When you're convinced that God approves of what you're doing, there's no line you won't cross. But religion didn't stop at violence. It also quietly redefined ordinary human virtues. Compassion became charity only when done in God's name. Love became sacred only if approved by Scripture. Humility became self-erasure in front of divine power. And courage, perhaps the greatest human quality, was replaced with obedience. Religious morality often celebrates weakness and submission as virtue. You're told to turn the other cheek, even when you're being harmed. You're told to forgive endlessly, even when injustice continues. You're told to pray for your enemies, instead of confronting their wrongdoing. Now, forgiveness and patience are good. But when they become excuses for inaction and silence, they're no longer moral. They become moral cowardice. Imagine a person watching their community suffer under oppression, yet they do nothing because they believe God will judge. That's not holiness, that's cowardice wrapped in piety. Religion has sold people the idea that being passive, humble, and silent is moral strength, but in reality, it's how injustice survives. Look at how churches and mosques preach submission to authority, even corrupt authority. In many societies, religious leaders tell people not to question rulers because only God can judge kings. They tell women to accept oppression with patience because God rewards the obedient. They tell the poor to be content because your reward is in heaven. And the result? Entire populations become docile. They stop resisting exploitation. They accept suffering as sacred. Religion turns what should be outrage into worship. That's not morality. That's moral fraud. True morality demands courage. It requires standing up against injustice, even if your entire community disagrees. It means doing what's right because you understand it's right, not because someone told you to. But courage is dangerous for religion. Courage leads to questioning, questioning leads to thinking, and thinking leads to freedom. So religion glorified obedience instead. It turned followers into sheep, gentle, harmless, and easily guided, and condemned wolves, the thinkers, the challengers, the rebels, as evil. Yet throughout history, it's the so-called heretics, not the saints, who advanced humanity. The scientists who defied scripture, the thinkers who questioned dogma, the reformers who risked everything to expose hypocrisy. Socrates, Galileo, Hypatia, Darwin, Russell. These people were condemned by religious morality because they dared to think, but they were the true moral pioneers. They acted on reason, not fear. They sought truth, not obedience. If religion's morality were truly divine, it would evolve with reason and evidence. But it doesn't. It resists progress. It defends outdated values under the label of eternal truth. Take slavery, for example. For centuries, the Bible and other scriptures justified owning human beings. Even when society evolved and began to see slavery as immoral, religious authorities resisted change, claiming, God's law is unchanging. The same pattern repeats today with gender rights, sexuality, and freedom of belief. Every time humanity moves forward, religion drags its feet, hiding behind ancient texts. And yet, when it finally gives in, it pretends it led the change all along. Religion takes credit for progress it once opposed, and blames humanity's sins for every regression it caused. That's the greatest illusion, the moral fraud, of religion. It makes people believe morality came from faith, when in truth, morality evolved in spite of it. Human empathy, logic, and social cooperation existed long before any holy book. Even animals show forms of moral behavior: compassion, fairness, cooperation. A mother risking her life for her child isn't thinking about divine reward. A firefighter saving strangers isn't doing it for heaven. That's real morality, selfless, courageous, human. Religion, however, teaches moral dependence. You're told you're nothing without God, that your goodness only counts if it's rooted in faith, that without divine command, you'd become a monster. That's a terrifyingly low view of humanity. But the evidence of daily life says otherwise. Atheists, agnostics, and secular societies are not less moral. They're often more moral. Countries with higher rates of non-belief have lower crime, higher equality, and greater human rights. Why? Because their moral foundation is built on reason, empathy, and shared responsibility, not fear of punishment. Meanwhile, deeply religious societies often suffer from corruption, inequality, and intolerance, the very things they claim their faith prevents. Let's look closer at how religion turns moral courage into sin and moral cowardice into holiness. When someone questions injustice within religion, they're called arrogant. When someone stays silent and obedient, they're called humble. When someone dares to think, they're accused of pride. When someone refuses to think, they're praised for faith. It's a system designed to keep people afraid of their own minds. A child is taught from the start: obey, don't question, believe without proof. If the child asks, why would God allow suffering? They're told, don't question God's plan. That single habit, suppressing questions, becomes the foundation of their moral thinking. So when they grow up and see cruelty or corruption, their instinct isn't to resist, it's to rationalize. Religion teaches people to excuse evil as divine mystery instead of confronting it as injustice. That's how moral paralysis begins. Let's take a simple example. Imagine a religious person living under an oppressive ruler who uses faith to justify tyranny. If that person stands up and speaks truth, they're accused of rebelling against God's chosen leader. If they stay quiet and suffer, they're told they'll be rewarded in heaven. So what happens? Most people stay quiet. They choose the safety of silence over the risk of truth. They become cowards, not because they're bad people, but because their moral education trained them to value obedience over integrity. Religion calls that submission a virtue. But think about history's genuine moral heroes. People who stood against power, cruelty, and superstition. They were rarely saints in the religious sense. They were thinkers, rebels, reformers, scientists, writers, and ordinary people who said no. They didn't wait for heaven to fix the world. They took responsibility for it themselves. Martin Luther King Jr., though deeply spiritual, didn't act out of blind faith. He acted out of reason, compassion, and moral conviction. He challenged the religious institutions that justified racism. The same applies to every reformer who refused to bow before unjust tradition. Meanwhile, religious institutions spent centuries protecting their own power instead of humanity. Take the Catholic Church during the plague. Instead of helping victims, it often blamed the poor, the Jews, or God's wrath. During slavery, Christian priests read verses commanding slaves to obey their masters. In Islamic history, caliphs justified conquest and slavery as divine will. In Hinduism, the caste system was defended as spiritual order. These systems survived because people were taught that questioning them meant questioning God. And yet, when these same societies eventually grew more humane, abolishing slavery, promoting equality, expanding rights, it wasn't divine revelation that did it. It was human conscience finally breaking free from divine fear. The moral progress of humanity is a story of defiance, not obedience. Now let's talk about everyday morality, the kind we live in daily life. Religion tells you it's wrong to lie, but encourages lying for faith. It tells you it's wrong to judge others, yet spends pages condemning those who don't believe. It preaches love, but threatens eternal torture for disbelief. It praises honesty, but demands blind belief in what can't be proven. It's a moral contradiction, a system that rewards hypocrisy as long as it protects belief. You can't claim to love your neighbor while believing they deserve eternal torment for thinking differently. That's not love. That's cruelty, dressed as concern. And yet, believers are taught to call it compassion. Saving souls. It's a strange morality that teaches people to pity others instead of understand them. And what about guilt? Religion thrives on guilt. From childhood, you're told you're born sinful, you're unworthy, you're flawed. You owe your very existence to divine mercy. You're constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly at risk of hell. That's not morality. That's mental slavery. A person driven by guilt can't be truly moral, because their motivation isn't understanding or empathy. It's fear and shame. Real morality isn't about fearing punishment. It's about recognizing the value of others. If a man helps his neighbor only because he fears divine anger, he's not moral. He's terrified. But if he helps because he understands suffering, that's morality. Religion has confused the two for centuries. Now, here's the irony. Religion claims to teach humility, but it secretly feeds arrogance. When someone believes they possess absolute moral truth from God, they stop listening to others. They stop questioning. They stop evolving. That's why religious moral codes are stuck in ancient times. They can't adapt, because to change would mean admitting they were wrong. But morality isn't carved in stone. It grows. It grows through dialogue, through empathy, through reason. It's how we abolished slavery, advanced women's rights, accepted scientific truth, and built democratic societies. And notice this pattern. Every time humanity moves one moral step forward, religion eventually follows. But only after resisting with all its might. That's the difference between moral courage and moral cowardice. Moral courage faces reality, even when it hurts. Moral cowardice hides behind divine excuses. Let's take real modern examples. When a woman fights for equality, she's often told by religious authorities to accept her God-given role. When a gay person seeks love and dignity, they're told it's sin. When someone leaves religion, they're labeled immoral. All of this stems from one false belief, that morality depends on belief in God. But here's the truth. Morality doesn't need God. Religion needs morality. Without moral language, religion would collapse, because it uses morality as a mask to justify its power. The idea that you need religion to be good is like saying you need chains to stay free. Let's think about that for a moment. The most basic moral principles, don't harm, be fair, tell the truth, care for others, don't require divine command. They arise naturally from empathy and reason. You don't need a holy book to tell you pain hurts, or that compassion matters. In fact, when people act morally against religious rules, It proves morality is independent. When someone helps others regardless of faith, or stands up for justice against religious authority, they are showing what real morality looks like. Human morality. Religion, on the other hand, keeps people morally dependent, like children who can decide right from wrong without a parent's voice. It infantilizes conscience, and when that voice is silent, when they think God is absent, their morality collapses. That's why so many religious people ask, without God, what stops you from killing or stealing? That question reveals the entire problem. If the only thing stopping someone from doing wrong is fear of punishment, then they are not good. They are restrained. True goodness doesn't need a threat. Real morality comes from understanding consequences, valuing others, and taking responsibility. Religion replaced that with surveillance. A sky watcher, always judging, always rewarding, always punishing. That's why believers often confuse moral discipline with divine fear. But when morality depends on surveillance, it's not virtue, it's control. And control is what religion has always been about. Control of thought, control of behavior, control of conscience. Because a free mind is the one thing religion can't own. The saints of religion were never truly moral. They were obedient. The moral heroes of humanity were never truly religious. They were courageous. Religion teaches people to fear doubt, but doubt is the seed of morality. Because doubt asks, is this right? And that question, more than any scripture, has guided human progress. When we stop asking that question, we become moral cowards. When we start asking it again, we become truly moral beings. So, saints or cowards? Maybe both. Saints in appearance, cowards in spirit. The moral fraud of religion is that it tells you to surrender your conscience and call it virtue. But the highest virtue is to keep your conscience alive, even when the world tells you to silence it. Morality isn't obedience, it's awareness. It's not fear of hell, it's love of truth. It's not submission to God, it's responsibility to humanity. That's what makes us human. Not saints, not sinners, just beings capable of reason, compassion, and courage. And that, perhaps, is the most moral thing of all.